Good morning, everybody. Thank you for connecting to this GEOENVI webinar. We are about to start. Some people are still connecting, so we'll start in 2 to 3 minutes. Thank you for your understanding. So I'm back. Thank you everybody. Good morning. I'm Philippe Dumas, the surgeon of EJEC. We are also the coordinator of this project GEOENVI, a really interesting project GEOENVI. I will show you why it's really interesting. Maybe you are familiar with this tool. I will start just some explanation so you can better understand how it works. As you can see from the agenda, we have a short presentation from myself and to the project, what is GEOENVI. After, I will give the floor to two experts. First, Adele Manzella to speak about what are the mitigation measures with some technical aspects to answer the concerns and environmental concerns about deep geothermal energy project. And after, we give the floor to another expert, Peter Valkering from Vito. I forgot to say that Adele, she's from the National Research Center of Italy. Peter Valkering is from Vito, the Belgian Research Center, and he will more deal with regulatory aspects, legislations, best practices, protocols. So you will know more about that. How works this tool, GoToWebinar? Some of you are familiar because it's the third webinar or the fourth webinar we've done in 2 weeks. So you listen to. When you have a question, you have three possibilities. The first one, you raise your hand, we open your mic, you ask your question, not immediately, when we have time, so at the end of the presentation or during the Q&A. Second option, you can ask your question in the option question, and you ask your question, and we will answer also or orally or with a written mode. And finally, we can chat, and you can use the chat to exchange with all our participants or our panelists. With that, I'm now starting my presentation, so I can ask my colleagues to maybe just say good morning, and after switch off the webcam. So Peter, Adele, if you can open your mic.
Hello, good morning.
Hello, good morning, everybody.
Okay, so thank you, and I'm about to start now the presentation. As you see in the agenda, what is the project GEOENVI? Where it come from? Where we speak mainly about deep geothermal energy. Deep geothermal energy, we see that we have many advantages, but today, especially in some regions in Europe, we are more confronted with a negative perception and a special attention to the environmental issues, and especially in the media. The media, they focus more on disadvantages than advantages. So one idea of GEOENVI was to tackle this issue of communication, of expertise, of providing information to answer these concerns. To do that, we have a consortium of 16 partners. The project started in November 2018. We are at midterm and we'll finish mid-2021. We decided to cover 6 countries: Italy, France, Hungary, Iceland, Belgium, and Turkey. If you're familiar with digital energy, you understand that with that we have a good geographical coverage to test some activities that will be replicated elsewhere for power production only, for power and heat production, cogeneration, or only for heat production in high temperature areas, in low temperature areas, different turbines, flash turbines, binary turbines, so different projects. With that, indeed, we want to test in 6 countries to replicate later in other countries in Europe, but also with, why not, international dimensions. To answer environmental concerns, we decided that it was key to have 3 kind of actors to provide credibility behind. First, as we deal with not only technical aspect, but also regulatory and political aspect, we have representatives from public environmental institutions and regulatory authorities. Secondly, we engage with market actors, industry, and project developers to have their view, but also to have their data, and we want to thank them for providing their data about the environmental performance of their project. Finally, we add also to have a third view of scientific experts, of researchers that are here also to provide this expertise in an independent way. Here you could see the mapping of the countries involved in our project. Here the work package structure, so how the project is developed. We have done the first phase, list the environmental aspect, develop the approach in a life cycle assessment perspective. It's not the objective today. It was a webinar 1 month ago. You can visit GEOENVI website and you'll find this webinar, how we deal with this life cycle assessment approach. Indeed, we need to have a full view if we want to understand environmental issues. And we develop special tools on environmental impact. We are now dealing with harmonization or replication of best practices regarding environmental regulations, and Peter will deal with that, and will engage with stakeholders to adopt solutions, notably on mitigation measures, and it's why Adele will present. So what I could say on the mapping of environmental matters, first, we have done an overall state of the art. The report is published, available online. We have done an analysis of the mitigation measures, and the report is published. The webinar today is about to present that indeed to stakeholders. We have also looked at how geothermal is in the perspective of other renewable energy sources. It's a report which is also available online, published. And finally, on but environmental matters, we have published a database which is available online, which is also for you to fill in. So you can also provide your case studies. You can visit on that. You need a certain expertise to understand the full parameters, but we are here also to support you and to answer any question you may have. Regarding LCA methodology, I will be short. It's not the objective of today. I say we have done a specific webinar on this topic 1 month ago, so I recommend you to look at the recording and of that. 2 reports are already published. Is the comprehensive assessment of a panorama of studies. We know that there are few studies with a LCA perspective, so it's why we aim at developing some guidelines to have later a simplified model, and we are for the moment performing this simplified model to have more case studies. So we are also about to publish some LCA studies in the next weeks. Regarding environmental aspect, we have done a report on the regulatory mapping. We are about to provide some recommendations on environmental regulations, and that is to come this summer. And finally, we engage in each country with market actors, with regulators to improve the regulation, better apply regulations, but also simplify procedure when needed. when we have done the LCA studies and notably the guideline simplified model, we want to disseminate that and to support market actors to engage with LCA and to develop LCA studies. So it's why we will have some training seminars soon, and we have a web-based platform for stakeholders to be more familiar with LCA. You can see all these materials in the website. We have done some physical events. Of course, in this specific period, we are still living with the quarantine and the pandemic, so we are not able for MAN to do any physical event, but we hope end of this year or early 2021 to do a physical event. And it's why we are for MAN doing a series of webinars for Europeans, but also with an international dimension. With this short introduction, you can ask any question you may have. We will have other activities like webinar and physical events to disseminate the results. As I say, our project will end in April 2021, so we have a bit less than 1 year to finish everything. What I did not mention, I can highlight, is that we're also a media campaign. We are monitoring a bit the news about geothermal in the media, and with that, we'll try to provide also some support tools to the market actors for answering some public concerns and how to deal with the media. I thank you for your attention, and now I will give the floor to Adele Manzella to report us, as you can see from the agenda, the problems and the technical solution for preventive and corrective mitigation measures. So Adele, the floor is yours. And I make you presenter.
Thank you, Philippe. I hope now you can see my slide.
I confirm.
Thank you. Hello, this is Adele Manzella, and I represent a large group of colleagues from many institutions participating to the project. And I am going to talk and review a little the problems that may arise to the environment due to the technological development of deep geothermal projects, but also and mainly preventive and corrective mitigation measures of these potential negative impacts and risks. I am stuck, sorry. I don't know what happens. Sorry, I have a technical problem with the. Okay, mitigation measures is a concept that does not pertain only to geothermal sector. It is a general concept of any technological development, and it's meant to, as a system, to reduce, avoid, or offset potential adverse environmental consequences. It is an integral part, it is foreseen and considered in the European Environmental Impact Assessment Directive, so it is regulated by law, and covers three main forms of measure. The first one is prevention, which means the problems are foreseen and avoided since the beginning, so prevented or reduced before it occurs. Corrective measures, which apply to those unavoidable impacts to reduce them to a level which is acceptable, and whatever preventive and corrective measures fails, compensatory measures are applied by law to compensate for unavoidable impact. In my review and in the activity that we have been working, we are not considering the compensatory measures, but we will focus on the solution to the problems. So, because we want to solve the problems, we are aware that problems may arise, but the main aim is to have only positive impacts, no risk. So, first of all, the first rule is prevention. Avoiding the problems in most cases considering potential negative effects as early as possible in the development, avoiding them using alternatives and preventive tools. Since this is not always possible, not all the X can be reduced to zero, the second rule is to mitigate the risk and the negative impacts while maximizing the positive impacts, not only the production of energy, either power, electricity, or heat, but also increase other indirect benefits of the geothermal development. But we would talk here only on technological solution for negative impacts and risks. They may arise in any part of the geothermal development, so mitigation measures apply in every part, in all phases of a geothermal project. And there are practices not only at the plant, the geothermal plant, but also in the surroundings. Mitigation affects the development, the construction, operation, and also the abandonment and decommissioning of the plants. The basic idea is that the important is to set up the problems. When the problems have been described and when set, we can find the solution, the technological solution to reduce to zero or to minimize the problems. We have been describing these technologies in a report from the GEOENVI project that can be accessed at this link. And in this report, we have reviewed monitoring technologies because the first part is to establish the level and intensity of the impact and risk. And then when that is done, controlling technologies to zeroing, so avoiding the problems, and for those which are unavoidable, reduce them to acceptable standards. The first part of our job has been to rank, to define the problem. So define what are the events that we have to control and mitigate. We have ranked these topics, subdividing them in 4 main categories that we will see. Of course, when we look at all these potential problems, in overall, we have the worst case scenario, where all the problems may occur at the highest level, because we want to describe how to face them. Of course, the presentation that I'm giving, as well as the report, is far representing a real case. Most of the effects that we are talking about are accidental or are restricted to very defined geological conditions, situation, or technologies. So we must be careful about this. Let's start reviewing these technologies. Of course, since the time is short, we will not go in the details, but I will give you just a brief overview of what we have been analyzing and describing. First of all, the effects associated to surface operation. They are mostly similar to other industrial development in some cases, but some of them are peculiar of the geothermal development. Energy and water consumption. So we want to reduce energy and water consumption to a minimum. These are unavoidable consequences of the geothermal development. The effects are monitored continuously during the whole life cycle of the geothermal development by recording energy use and losses and water consumption, and they are prevented by planning the optimal use, and most of the corrective measures are related to mitigate the effect by reducing electricity consumption by using local electricity generation, especially from renewable. We reduce the water consumption by recirculating the drilling mud, or collect meteoric water or low quality surface water use it as makeup fluid and so on. So there is plenty of measures of this kind. Waste production from surface operator is monitored by law by making use of official log of waste production and by regular inspection of all the tanks and storing places for waste. They are prevented and corrected by technologies which are very common to any industrial development. So proper tanks, basins and areas for where material is segregated in order to avoid any contact with ecosystem, with the soil, with the water. Waste recycling, correct disposal, a special care about hazardous waste. All of these technologies and practices are applied by law, actually. Land occupation, visual impacts, noise, vibration, most of these effects are monitored by sensors like seismic sensor for vibration, acoustic characterization, smell assessment. It is important in this case to set up a proper monitoring planning starting before the plant operation. The importance of establishing a background level for these impacts is important for this topic and also for many others. So that it is important to establish a background in order to check with respect to a natural background what is the real effect of the industrial development of a geothermal geothermal project. There is plenty of technologies used for this kind of problems, like landscape planning, reducing the impact of drilling rigs, choosing rigs that occupy less land or reduce the height. Noise reduction is for noise reduction there is plenty of tools and equipment to reduce it to a minimum, and always there is a law enforcing to reduce it below a threshold which is defined by law. Prevention of dust by cleaning the roads, water spray, and so on. There are so many technologies that can be read about in the report. Leaks of liquid from surface operation are monitored by periodical inspection, and also it is important to monitor the occurrence and evolution of corrosion and scaling, because leaks can be due to corrosion and scaling of pipes and tanks. Prevention and corrective measures are also related to a good management of pipes and tanks for liquid from surface operation. It is also important to avoid corrosion problems, so by proper choice of materials or coatings, anti-corrosion, the use of anti-corrosion products, great care of chemicals that must be stored in segregated areas. What is peculiar of geothermal development is proper choice of the secondary fluids, for example, for binary plants, chemical inhibitors of corrosion and scaling. So these liquid must be stored and disposed very carefully. Let's review now the effects associated to emission of underground material to the surface. So what are the effects when fluids or pieces of rocks from the underground arrive to the surface? They may potentially create problems at the surface. One problem could be related to liquid and solid effusion, which are monitored by sampling liquid and rocks pieces, analyzing them for target contaminants. This can be done continuously or periodically, and this is done at each intermittent or continuous discharge point, like at the wellhead, the cooling towers, the drains for spent liquid. And there is always a monitoring of waste and surface wastewater. This problem is prevented by a proper collection and disposal of the material, by reinjecting the liquid in the reservoir so that no liquid is dispersed in the environment. A proper choice of non-polluting drilling fluid additives, mud recycling, drilling mud recycling during the drilling operation. Fluids are also, in case the geothermal fluids are in contact, come in contact with the oxygen, with the atmosphere, it is important to treat them with biocides to avoid any pollution underground. An effective water management may effectively reduce to a minimum this problem. Degassing instead is when not the liquid but the gaseous part of the fluids arrive in the atmosphere. This doesn't happen all the time. Actually, it is a very peculiar problem which arises in a few cases. It is monitored at 3 main levels. At the power plant, because usually this is a problem that may arise when the fluid is particularly hot and rich of gas content. And so there is a control at the power plant. There is a general control of air quality in the surrounding environment, and also check. It would be important to check also the natural gas and also temperature emission from the soil to understand first of all, the background, so before the plant operation, if possible. That has not been always possible when for the very old operating plants, and during operation. The monitoring can be done periodically or continuously, depending on the network that is used. It is prevented by the so-called preventer. For example, at the drilling, at the wells during the drilling, to avoid accidental release. The complete capture and reinjection of gases would be the optimal solution, and a lot of technologies are now able to do that. Also by hybrid technologies for power production, for example. But in some cases, total reinjection is not at the commercial, so there are not commercial technologies in a few cases where this is not possible, complete reinjection, or at least not demonstrated. In such cases, in any case, the degassing is kept to a minimum and below the threshold, the acceptable threshold or defined threshold by law, by abatement systems of most of the harmful gases. The CO2 has been reinjected in some cases, or have been captured and utilized for other uses. Methane is, in case of some amount of methane, that is can be either reinjected, or in some cases it has been separated and burned for local electricity production. Drift eliminators and minimum time for unavoidable degassing are common practice in geothermal operation. Radioactivity may arise in some cases when rocks, underground rocks and fluids are naturally presenting radioactive material. So it is important to record the background condition before the industrial operation, and periodic monitoring samples of rocks and fluids, also upscaling in the pipes and geothermal waters. It is essentially phased by adapting the normal protection in this case, the material are so-called classified as norm, so naturally occurring radioactive material. Specialized companies can treat and dispose of this material. To prevent the radioactivity due to fluids rich of naturally occurring radioactive material, total reinjection and prevention of scales reduce to a minimum this problem. Blowout is when the gas accidentally is lost during drilling or, in very, very rare case, operation. The blowout is monitored by sensor during drilling operation to display critical parameters, and continuous checking to check for early warning signs of potential blowout. It is a common practice to have all wells equipped with blowout preventers. And it is important that drilling is performed by well-trained personnel. A good drilling practice reduce to or totally zero the occurrence of this problem. And there are other operative preventive measures, very, very technical, that whose description is quickly provided in the report, especially for reservoir which have a very high pressure, where so the risk is particularly high, although it is very manageable. The effects associated to geomechanical changes are essentially two: the ground surface deformation and seismicity. Let's see ground surface deformation, which is nowadays monitored making use of remote sensing technologies to monitor the ground level. It is important to monitor them before and during operation, and installing benchmarks to have a reference during the operation. The main technology to reduce, to minimize this problem is injecting or reinjecting fluid in the geothermal reservoir to control land subsidence and controlling the extraction rate. These are managed making use also of prediction based on numerical modeling. Seismicity, also continuously monitored by seismic networks, is in this case is very, very important to have a historical record of seismicity level in the area. So record also in detail before and then during the operation. The first prevention measure is probability assessment of the hazard and of the risk. This is followed by the correct balance between the produced and reinjected fluid in order to minimize the changes in pore pressure in the underground. Reactive protocols are established in many places, for example, traffic light system, to define the threshold level at the local scale, and then operational protocols to say what we have to do when a certain threshold is passed. It is important, of course, to define if a seismic event is related to the operation or it is natural, and then know what to do in case of a certain level is passed, and by further control, so by re-establishing the balance, or in some cases suspending the activities. Finally, underground physical and chemical modification are related to pressure and flow changes monitored in the wells in the underground with logging of pressure, temperature, logging of chemical sample, chemical analysis of underground fluids, specialized tests. Periodically, the wells are also shut down for pressure check and pipe cleanings. Prevention is by injection or reinjection of fluids in the reservoir to re-establish or minimizing the pressure decline in the underground. Of course, this requires a reinjection or injection strategy to be to avoid reinjection failures, such as short cutting, so changes in pore pressure due to reinjection or temperature reduce, which may cause again a change in the permeability, and so indirectly a pressure change. The recovery of the pressure is guaranteed also by a proper management of the wells. This is done especially in large projects, in large field management, the so-called harnessing of the resources. So when plenty of wells is available, some wells can be left to rest while others are in production, and then this condition is changed with time to re-establish, like in harnessing a field, also the resource can be harnessed and kept at a more or less the same level, as it happens in many fields in the world. An important topic is the interconnection of aquifer, or the disturbance of aquifer others than the geothermal resource during drilling in particular, and very seldom during operation. It is important to monitor for this casing condition, the flow rate in geothermal wells, but also the piezometric and water quality control in other wells in the surroundings of the geothermal project, to check if there is any interconnection. This problem can be prevented by optimal well design, so correct use of casing and material, optimal drilling work, cementation, casing, and so on. And in case of an accident, so by definition a very rare occurrence, there are plenty of specialized condition for workover and patching of new casing and so on. Finally, underground physical and chemical modification are thermal changes in the underground, which is monitored by temperature logs and prevented by the proper balance of between fluid extraction and the natural or reinjection inflow of water. And it is important to carefully define the sites for injection well, to avoid cooling of the underground condition by injection of cold fluids. Final comments. Nowadays, monitoring, so establishing what is the level of environmental impacts and risk, is common practice. Data are checked against established limit values, which in most cases are defined by law. All those technologies or practices that we have analyzed have proved to be effective. So there are data clarifying that a acceptable level has been reached by applying correct measures. Of course, this doesn't mean that we are already at the maximum level. Research and innovation is proceeding on this topic. Innovative solutions are coming every day, and of course there is a continuous improving, but we are already at a level that is clearly safe and sound. This is the main result of this overview that have been done, and I invite you to read all the details in the report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adele, for this really interesting and extensive overview. I don't know if you have any question. Feel free to raise your hand or to ask your question, but now I will give a floor to Peter for presenting us more regulatory aspects. So Peter, the floor is yours. I make you presenter. You're muted.
Hello, everybody.
Yes.
Can you confirm you can hear me, see my screen? Okay, just a second, I have to. Okay, yes, my name is Pieter Valkering. This presentation, give it on behalf also of my colleagues and others who worked on it, also in particular the national leads who have been contributing to the analysis of environmental regulations. So the ambitions of this work package is basically twofold. On the one hand, we try to map and analyze the current status of environmental regulations and practices for deep geothermal energy development. And based on that, we are engaging with stakeholders and decision makers to develop recommendations to actually improve the regulatory practice. So it is really from regulation to implementation. So we try not to stick to what is, so say, to the real legal side, but also try to get a better view of how things are working out in practice and how this can be improved. As the main work package structure, also to get a context of our work. So there are, you could say, two main parts in green, which is then the mapping of the environmental regulations, for which we have produced our first deliverable, which I will briefly discuss afterwards. And then we're moving on to recommendations, which is the work that still is ongoing and needs to be done over the coming year. So both elements are supported by a stakeholder engagement process, where we have in principle three main steps, which is informing stakeholders about the project, engaging with them in the discussion about barriers and solutions, and last but not least, to discuss actions. So the current status, we are more or less in the middle, and I will then mainly in this talk share the insights so far from our mapping and also from the first scoping we did with stakeholders about what are crucial issues to address more in detail. So let's first talk about the environmental regulations. I would like to invite you also to have a look in our first deliverable, which gives you quite a detailed analysis of a variety of aspects of environmental regulations in the different case study countries. So it is really the basis for the formulation of our further recommendations. It consists of 6 country reports. So that will be in Belgium, France, Hungary, Italy, Iceland, and Turkey. And then for each country, there is an overview of general data, institutional context, and policy visions as an introduction. And then we go more in depth on regulation mapping. So the latter is also, we look into different aspects. We start from the basis, the definition, the classifications, and so on. Then we go to more the process aspects, the permitting procedures, how this is organized. And last but not least, we look into 11 specific environmental impacts and risks, like the ones that Adela just presented, and we go into the specific regulations on those topics. So just to give you a very quick peek preview, a first observation that we made is that if you link the different aspects to the different regulatory fields, you see that it is quite comprehensively covered on the one hand, but it's also fragmented, you could say, because there are the different impacts are usually not treated under one domain. So, for example, the surface disturbance, for example, typically relates to air quality aspects, the noise and vibration, landscape aspects, and so on. Sorry, I see my. So on the top here are on the left side here are the different impacts and risks we considered. This is a previous version to the ones that Adela presented, but there's more or less a one-to-one correspondence to the different impacts also we consider in our final report. And on the bottom here, you see the different policy fields where these impacts are covered. So we made an overview of main international and EU directives. So here you see the example of the main European directives that are of relevance for each of these fields considered. So I won't go over that in detail, but if you are interested, you can read further in our report. And then we went down to the national level, where we have tried to understand, okay, so what are the regulations applied for each impact or risk considered? What's the scope also in terms of the scale? Sometimes this is a more local oriented policy or a national policy or a regional policy in between. What are key thresholds adopted, if they are, and what explicit measures for mitigation and monitoring are included in the legislation. So some observations very briefly on classification and permitting. So in principle, we see that these definitions and the rules are largely similar, but the classifications of different types of geothermal resources do vary significantly. What's also interesting is that the number of authorities involved in permitting differs among countries. So where in some countries it's very much centralized for a single, say, office or authority which is in charge. In other cases, it can be much more diverse, which makes it a little bit more complex. Then environmental impact assessment procedures are, of course, present in each country, but the way it is incorporated in the overall permitting procedures does differ. And then if you go to the observations on the coverage of environmental impacts, so a first observation, a learning from our own side, it was quite challenging to get this full overview, because also it is comprehensive, but also fragmented, or at least covered under different domains and also different scale levels. So overall, it is not that we have seen any major blind spots, so to say, because things are either covered by specific legislations and guidelines, or they are more covered in the actual permitting processes, in the environmental impact assessment procedures, or even there is simply good practice among project developers and operators more on a voluntary basis. So although this is we think is quite a good basis to work further from, we certainly see this as a stepping stone to the further understanding of how we can really contribute to improvements in the regulatory practice. So the further questions we defined are still, what are now the main regulatory gaps or challenges we can link up to? Also because the analysis so far was very broad, there is still room for getting further details on how thresholds, technical prescriptions, and other mitigation measures are really dealt with in practice, and what can be considered good practice. Yeah, also what's informal aspects come into play. Is it always on paper the way how it works in reality? And basically the format we also thought of proceeding is to try to understand which elements of different countries can be considered good practices that can be shared among countries. So to get a further scoping, we used the first policy workshops, which I will discuss then and now. So what we have been doing is we organized the first round. As you can see here, some of the figures on the types of stakeholders that we engaged in these workshops. Typically, they were from policy, industry, and research, and certainly also some participation from societal groups. And in each country, it looked a little bit differently, but they all were sticking to a common type of format, where we also had, besides the typical presentations, of course, about what we are trying to do in GEOENVI, also discussions, focus groups, and also we did a survey among survey participants to get a view on their on what they think are the main impacts that can be considered by the project, the main regulatory challenges that they see. So the survey of the workshop participants, as said, this was mainly to provide an interactive element during the workshops to support the discussion, and also it gave us a first view according to the workshop participants. So that's of course not a big representative survey, but it still gave an interesting view on what is considered main impacts and risks, what are key issues for the regulatory framework, and topics of public perception and participation. So the example that you see on the screen now is the question that we asked: what do you think are from all those 11 impacts that we considered are most relevant in your country? And here is the example for Belgium. We asked it in two variations. On the one hand, what do you think is important, and also what do you think the public finds most important? And you see then that, for example, in Belgium, currently the issue of seismicity is high on the agenda, but also a noise, for example, another service disturbance, where also the idea is that this is more important according to the public than according to experts themselves. Again, based on the opinion of the experts. So what it gave us is an overview of key impacts, for example. It's one of the elements, but it's quite an important one to further scope our exercise. So what you see here is, again, our 11 impacts and risks, and the importance as we have seen it from the workshops in the different countries considered. And you see that typically each country has basically different main issues. So for example, whereas seismicity is a rather important issue in Belgium and France, degassing is much more of an issue in other countries, and so on. So from both the analysis of the regulations, our first deliverable, and the input we received from the workshops, we have come to a set of what we think are cross-cutting topics that we need to focus on further, and that are also I see as the part of the main conclusions of our work so far. So on the one hand, these are the topics related to concrete impacts and risks. So here we see induced seismicity in ground surface deformation as important, as there is still a variety of guidelines for monitoring seismicity and thresholds and so on. But we feel that there is room to better understand what is now best practice there and how different countries can benefit from such recommendations. For the interconnection of aquifers, it's a little bit similar in principle. This is well regulated and covered in various directives, but again, there is quite a difference country to country into how monitoring guidelines are applied, and also for technical prescriptions. Emissions from degassing, in particular the greenhouse gas emissions, we think there are, it's not yet well regulated, and these are, this is a topic to be improved. And finally, also liquid waste, and then we talk about the waste of the geothermal fluids is a topic to focus on. So that's on the one hand side, and then on the other we have what we call the more process issues, the more generic issues. So how to deal with complex licensing and delays. So going, so say, apart from the fact that of course a proper regulation is very much needed, at the same time we want to keep it, say, efficient and yeah, manageable for in terms of getting the required permits and so on. So how to do that in the best way. A specific topic is accounting for the nature of individual projects. So if each deep geothermal project would be the same, it would be rather easy to set up a very dedicated procedure, but we find that it's actually very context dependent. So how to keep that flexibility in the environmental impact assessment procedure. Dealing with uncertainty, so a number of impacts and risks, environmental impacts and risks are not always 100% clear prior to the development stage. So there are assessments, but they can yeah, change in as experience unfolds. So how to deal with that topic. Communication and social acceptance involves typically information sharing, how to make sure that the proper information that there is actually transmitted to the broader public, and that we avoid cases of misinformation. And also we thought that positive communication, so how to change this the debate from only the negative impacts, say, that's a bit overdoing maybe a little bit, but to a more balanced communication where positive aspects and negative aspects are in balance discussed. And finally, also on the formal process of public participation, we defined it as one of those topics. So then I come to my last slide. So the conclusions and next steps. We have, we think, a good basis for co-developing and disseminating our recommendations through our review of current regulations, also our engagement of a network of stakeholders and key players, and first insights into our key regulatory challenges. So the next steps are the sharing of good practices among case study countries and cross-cutting topics, and of course also using the information on mitigation measures and so on that Adele just presented. So we are working on sort of templates to share this information. We will gather that information not only from our partner networks, the partners within the GEOENVI project, but also broader. We will organize a next round of workshops in the fall, where we will discuss these topics in further detail based on the information and the input we provide from the project, and enter in that discussion with our stakeholders, and from that work on the compilation of recommendations, which is projected for early next year. So thank you very much from my side, and if there are any questions, please feel free.
Thank you very much, Peter, for also this really clear and exhaustive presentation. We have one question. The first one is for Adele. So if you can open your mic, also switch off. Yes. So
Hello.
One question for you, Adele, was regarding the probabilities of such an event. So what are the probabilities associated with the different risks, seismicity, radioactivity, degassing, blowout?
Well, that is defined case by case. There is an overall probability. Some of these topics, as I said, are not a problem in certain places. For example, radioactivity is not a problem everywhere, or degassing, for example, because they are very much related to the local condition of the underground, geological condition. So there isn't an overall probability, but in most of these topics, probability is defined in the early stage of the development, exactly to define a proper design of the operation. And in most cases, it's also required by the environmental impact assessment. So the probability of certain occurrence is requested during the authorization process.
And maybe here I can also refer to another project maybe you're not familiar with, but you should be, is GeoRisk. Indeed, in GeoRisk, we have done a full list of potential risk, not for the environment, but also for a project developer in terms of financing risk and how it can have a coverage. So with that, I will recommend you to look at this risk register on the GeoRisk project. You can find the link to the EJEC website. Now I have a second question for you, Peter. I will read it. You don't think that most of the environmental requirements from the regulator are very similar at those of the oil and gas industry, from where you can easier extrapolate and fine-tuning for geothermal purpose?
Yeah, I think that is possibly true. We haven't, I think a lot of those aspects are not dedicated also to deep geothermal. So in general, there are the drilling requirements. They are certainly similar to requirements that are holding for other fields like oil and gas industry, I think, yeah.
And what we have seen also is that indeed you have a tradition in Europe which is different regarding the mining law, the mining code, and all that is linked with licensing and procedures. I know, Adele, maybe you can also use this opportunity to explain what is the situation in Italy, for example, to detail a bit that.
Sorry, I was unmuting. Well, licensing in a way is very similar for the licensing process is very similar for geothermal and oil and gas. The law in a lot of places applies the same way. So it is true. It is true. This is. I would just say that it is not only oil and gas. This is true for underground operations. So there is a similarity for underground operation, but there are a lot of other aspects which are exactly the same for other industrial development. All those topics that I mentioned related to surface operation, a lot of them are very, very similar to other industrial development. So we are trying to mapping those which are peculiar to geothermal, to the geothermal industry, and trying to find the best practice, as Peter said, to arrive to recommendation based on real cases, on real cases of good practice and good results from various countries.
Indeed. I don't know if you have from the audience, the participants, one more question. I say you can raise your hand and we open your mic. You can ask orally your question or you can write your question. Indeed, we had a quite extensive presentation, a bit hard to digest, but okay, just a question from our colleagues and friend from New Zealand, Chris Bromley. How to fine-tune regulations and policies for different community acceptance thresholds? Example, seismicity, H2S, hot spring interference, tourism landscape value. So how to fine-tune regulations and policies for different community acceptance thresholds?
Well, that's a good question, of course. I mean, I don't know what is meant with fine-tune, but obviously I think that the regulation can play a crucial role to establish a certain level of trust that is needed, that certain impacts are properly monitored and that proper action will be taken if things are reaching an above critical level, for example. So I do think it is an important precondition for creating acceptance. At the same time, it is not the only thing that needs to be done. So it's also something we have been asking in our survey to the participants of our workshops. Actually, what is the most important to increase acceptance? And it is very clear that at least there are a lot of other factors involved. So for example, it's also about making sure that there is adequate information and that there is not the discussion is not guided by misinformation. Of course, there's also many, say, critical information which is correct, but of course that there can be also misinformation we want to avoid. And for example, to have that positive view where there might be negative aspects or risks, but there are also positive aspects, benefits, and it's always a balance. So and finally, I mean, the participation of the public, for example, is also crucial for that to create acceptance. So again, we don't have the final answer, unfortunately, on the question. It's on our radar, and we're also trying to look for good practices in that respect. So any also suggestions or experiences from New Zealand could be very interesting to take into account.
What I can maybe add is that what we see at European level, it's not only regulation for community acceptance, more community engagement, which is another step indeed. For energy communities, we see a huge development, and it's also regulated for the first time in the recast of the Renewable Energy Directive of the European Union in 2019. We have an article dedicated to this topic. In geothermal, we have seen several crowdfunding activities, but also Tuscany is one of a good example of engagement with local economic development with communities. I have another question that I can answer. It's from Franz Lae from the INERI, so the French risk body. The question is that about a database of incidents in geothermal. It's an ongoing work. It was an initiative already coming from project developers to have this list and this database of incidents, notably the impact for workers. We are currently building that. We have created the template, and the consultation will be launched probably during this summer period for all project developers and operators to fulfill this survey in a pure, transparent, but also confidential way. With that, I think we have answered all the questions, and it's time probably to close this webinar. I thank you all for attending. I thank you, the speakers, for your great presentation. I'm sure that it will take time for everybody to digest all the information. You will find this presentation online. And of course, as we say, we are not at the end of the GEOENVI project. We still have a bit less than 1 year, but still quite a lot of to do to deliver this database of incidents, this LCS studies, this recommendation on regulations, and this dissemination of the project results. With that, I thank you all. I wish you a nice day if you're in Europe, or a nice end of the day or night if you're elsewhere all over the world, and hope to see you soon in GEOENVI. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.